So I'm so happy to be here with Will and with Valerie, talking about something that I think is very timely and yet in some ways has been plaguing our communities for quite some time. Environmental racism is nothing new here in New Mexico and in the Southwest. And so I think it's a really poignant time to have conversations about how environmental racism continues to affect our communities of color and our Indigenous communities. I want to talk about place-based forms of knowledge, non-Western forms of knowledge, Indigenous forms of knowledge that aren't necessarily acknowledged or considered through a traditional science-based, Western-based kind of lens, and how when we look at these other kinds of knowledge systems that have persisted and that have defined cosmologies and how we know the world for so long, how those actually can lead us forward. So let's start that with that question about, what place-based knowledge and this non-Western knowledge means to both of you in your practices.
I can jump in. I just have to acknowledge that Native people have been scientists for a long, long time. We've been keen observers of the world, ethnobotanists, cartographers. We have had this evidence of high skills mathematics and the Mayan pyramids in Chaco Canyon and the building of roadways, in the petroglyphs and pictographs that are painted on walls are actually something that we haven't even completely figured out what the messaging is, but we definitely know it's certainly a relationship between observation and just the wisdom of thousands of years of knowledge and understanding how we do farming, how we practice curanderismo. This is our relationship with the stars is inherent. And I think as we move forward, we have to remind our youth that these are components which are not always taught in Western science, and that our migration, our oral histories, our creation stories are all part of our worldview, but they also inform us of what's happened within the natural world. I think that more and more we're starting to see it's important to know what's in your backyard, what plants, how animals are changing, how to create a shelter, where sources of water are. All those things are very important as we continue forward, as we know there's going to be climate change. I hope that we prepare our youth in these meaningful ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that your point about being scientists or, keen observers, ethnobotanists, people who've kind of worked in conjunction with natural resources to develop, seed that functions as this incredible technology, like in different kind of environs in the Southwest is something that I've thought a fair amount about. I've also thought about how far away like I feel from that, even though I'm only like 1 or 2 generations like from that knowledge, and how quick that has transformed. And I think, I don't know, a lot of my work is kind of responding to like the traumatic realization of that like distance and shift, but then also thinking about ways to respond and to get back to that knowledge, because the people who hold that, those culture bearers and those knowledge bearers, those Indigenous scientists are still with us, and they still hold that knowledge, and it's there to be kind of accessed and learned. And I think it's actively going on. It's just not happening at the same kind of level that it had historically. But yeah, I mean, when you were talking about knowing our environment, like I've often thought about, like, I know more about the layout of like Target or like Walmart than I do about like the living creatures in, like, you know, the immediate radius of where I live. And that's a kind of shocking thing.
I think one of the kind of issues that we see is that climate change isn't actually really that new. You know, it's been happening in New Mexico for quite some time just because of the fact that we've been extracted from for so long. And so, you know, like even though it's a trending kind of thing to talk about and to create policy around, that's also something that's persisted in our communities as well. Like we have this knowledge and this resilience, and then we also have extractive industries um, that have, you know, really targeted our communities here. Um, and so I'm wondering, you know, now that we have this kind of foundation in terms of what knowledge looks like or can look like, you know, we can tackle this question, which, you know, is it's deceptively simple and yet so complex. What is environmental racism? And specifically, what is it here?
I think that climate change has started, and it really just dates back to the earth is dynamic. I think Native people have always known this. And I was thinking back about your introduction and how we are now acknowledging everywhere we go what Indigenous folks' land that we're on, but we forget that there are stories that date back and we don't include everyone. My Apache ancestors have told me that Santa Fe, where I'm residing now, has been their home for a long time. And even though they're down in Mescalero on the reservation that they were forced to be put on, that there are stories of watching the volcanoes erupt here from the plateau of Santa Fe. So I feel like we've always been in this dynamic environment. And if you think about geologically speaking, when those volcanoes erupted, those were thousands of years ago. And we are told by anthropologists that Navajo and Apache entered 500 years ago, right? Into the Four Corners region. We migrated from somewhere over Athabascan, all these other things. So we have to constantly challenge ourselves in what we think. But environmental racism, I see it as two different things. I see it towards a deliberate placement of the extraction industry, of dumping chemicals and toxic waste into certain people's backyards. I see it as energy production and polluting industry being deliberately placed in marginalized communities. Those happen to be low income, the majority of folks being color a lot of times, but not always, right? The Appalachians are a good example. There are, I think the biggest difference between the racism aspect and just what people think of as environmental justice issues is that if it's deliberate, that means that the folks who are being borne the brunt of environmental toxins, they don't have the privilege of other folks. They don't have resources, money to hire lawyers for their defense. They're working several jobs sometimes as essential workers. And that means that they can't afford to take time off so that they can voice their comments and their concerns at hearings. Maybe they've been shut out of the legislative process because they just don't have the broadband or the internet access. And so a lot of times folks are just discouraged from even coming forth about racism and don't even realize that it's happening because they're just trying to survive the daily life. But there's also the cumulative impacts that we don't think about, the socioeconomic inequalities, and the fact that this is all combined with folks who are now dealing with COVID. And so they just don't have the bandwidth, the capacity themselves to engage in a system that right now is upholding white supremacy. So that's how I sort of see that from a human aspect, but then there's an environmental justice aspect of what's happening to our natural world. And from an indigenous lens, the river and all the creatures, the earth itself is a deity, it's an entity that has life and deserves respect and privileges just as we do. Those are my thoughts. Well,
I don't know, just maybe to pick up on what you were just saying about like granting rights of like agency and recognition to you know, rivers and, you know, areas of land, mountains, you know, kind of understanding that like, we're part of that, and that those spaces deeply affect the way that our lives kind of play out, and that those, you know, that power needs to be respected and granted rights. And, you know, I guess if we have this kind of structure that we've developed around how we allot that power, that has to be recognized. You know, like in New Zealand, you know, they'll give rights to rivers, like, you know, quote unquote, human rights or natural rights, right? That are on the same kind of level as human rights. And, you know, in the United States, we give corporations rights, you know. It also makes me think maybe too, in terms of climate change, of, I don't know, people have talked about like this ancestral Puebloan like collapse that actually happened over the course of a few hundred years, you know. I mean, if we think about our own kind of existence in relation to a few hundred years, we're kind of approaching like world environmental collapse in a couple hundred years, you know. I mean, the people who were moving, they were responding to also climate change, but I think a much more kind of naturalistic version of that. So, you know, even the way that kind of that's been talked about and theorized, I think is kind of problematic, and it speaks back to this kind of structural issue in relation to, you know, kind of science and I guess whose science it is, or whose like environmental assessment it is, you know. So I guess that's, you know, some thoughts about that.
I mean, I think this question of like deliberate actions is really important to think about, because environmental racism, like racism, is not passive, right? It's not just, it happened, right? Somebody enacts it, and there are policies that are enacted against communities of color. And there are, you know, the really diffuse ways that happens that maybe are less visible or even graspable. And then there are the obvious and blatant ways that environmental racism takes place. And you know, I wonder if we can talk about that, like the visibilizing of environmental racism, and how we can actually grasp onto this, what some people might consider to be very abstract, but what is actually very material and embodied and surrounding us, right? So maybe we can talk about that a little bit in terms of, you know, whether it's aesthetic practice, or, you know, Valerie, some of the things that you've observed, Will, some of the things that you've observed, you know, in the Navajo Nation, observed or not observed, right? But you know, they're there.
Mm-hmm.
I have some slides, if you don't mind, I can share, because I think it's important
Yeah.
to seeing is believing, right?
Yeah, that's like such a kind of like Western thing, you know?
Yeah. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
All right, this is a really great quote, and it's from a book, Ecocide of Native America. And I'll read it real quick. I quote it in my book about the Four Corners, the land sacrifice zone. It's no accident, therefore, that the remote, sparsely populated West has been targeted so often in recent years by Eastern policymakers as a receptacle of deadly technological experiments. It's not just that we get these experiments because there's more room out here. It's more deliberate than that. This is a consciously evolved policy, a dangerous trend in United States history, and it has resulted in a de facto national policy of trading ecosystems, national sacrifice areas for economic gain, scientific data, and national security. And I really think that that quote speaks to the heart of what's going on in our back of the neck of the woods. And I just want to share a couple of slides just so you can see that up above is the Gila River with wagons crossing 1885, and down below is the San Carlos Apache who used to roam that area, but don't anymore, and have been displaced for reasons. But as you can see, life does not look the way it does today. And now we know that there's this huge biological diversity, and we're worried about saving the Gila for different reasons, not that it's associated with these cultural connections, but these endemic species that can't be found elsewhere. So this is a layer of our system that maybe is invisible to most folks. We don't think about. We don't have the ecological integrity of all the bugs and creepy crawlies making our world go round and decomposing waste and whatnot. We are missing out on what life is really about. And some of that environmental racism that we don't think about is something that we forget, which is our basic water rights. Just in the news last week, I saw the state of Virginia that created a bill that would give humans access, basically the right, all humans within their state, the right to water. And I thought, well, here we are fighting for Rio Grande water all the time. And Anthony is 30 minutes away from the border of Mexico. So and water rarely makes it down the Rio Grande because of this racism of placing water rights to northern users, to other rights holders that have been fighting over it for hundreds of years. And yet we forget about the system, right? And that the actual river itself deserves the water rights. We also forget about the militarization that has happened. And Fort Wingate is a great example of something that was enacted in our history, which we forget about this long walk period of time where people were rounded up, a scorched earth policy that removed folks from their homeland, purposely incarcerated them, and then made them come back to receive rations and to work and to go to BIA schools at Fort Wingate and other places. This is an example of ethnic cleansing, but here's what happened to the land afterward. That militarization then turned into national security. So the little concrete bunkers that you see are lined and they haven't gone anywhere. They're contaminated with World War II, Vietnam era ammunitions, and other chemicals, hantavirus from back in the day, and a lot of uranium cleanup, or a lot of uranium toxins that have not been cleaned up because we were using weapons and housing them there. We forget the biggest incident that has happened in New Mexico, and this isn't popularized because we were supposedly sparsely populated, but July 16, 1979 was the largest uranium waste tailing spill in all of the United States. No one talks about that. And the area still hasn't been cleaned up. That's an example. And the uranium that was produced by the mines really impacted the workers. It was something that plagued the actual miners and their families that made their homes out of the extracted rock. And we still have over 500 abandoned uranium mines from this era of nuclear war development. And as a result, what we're seeing today is that folks who lived in these areas and often worked, they relied on spring water. And now during COVID, they lack infrastructure, they lack electricity. And the home up at the top is an example of being in the Four Corners area where there's P&M lines going back and forth, but the homes still lack electricity. And the World Health Organization has recognized that water should be fundamental for not only economic development, but just the basics of human life. It should be a human right. And what Navajos are doing now is hauling water still, but from non-potable sources, from sources of, because they can't often find water in the grocery stores of Walmart and Gallup and Farmington during the COVID times. They can't get out that far. They've been on lockdown. And even if they go hours and hours away, they still can't find resources. You know how scarce it's been with toilet paper, right, during this pandemic. So these folks have been relying on wells that are contaminated with uranium. So this era of environmental justice continues to plague our region. This is Los Alamos. And the picture at the bottom is what they call Acid Canyon, where waste was literally just shot out of a pipe and let go into the drainage systems, which of course, you know, finds its way into our groundwater systems. And we wonder why Santa Fe and Albuquerque have uranium contamination in our drinking water. It's because of these hydrological connections. And Los Alamos has been given under the Trump administration $3 billion to continue the development of nuclear weapons. This is something that continues to plague us. And who knows what the Biden administration is doing now about it, but that's something that we can act on, that we can encourage the use of that water to maybe take that $3 billion and put it towards infrastructure so people will have running water and sanitation for their homes. That's an idea, right? Basic human right. And I just want to show you that the drainage systems from Los Alamos eventually dump into the Rio Grande. Where does the Rio Grande go? If there's water allowed, it's supposed to dump into the Gulf of Mexico, right? But before it gets there, it's supposed to also feed us. And it goes through Hatch. And it's used by acequias from north to south. And so it's not just Los Alamos and that drainage that it affects us all. And here's a great map that the pioneers put together, just what kind of contamination is across the board. And the big orange blob in the middle is the result of the first atomic bomb that was tested in Chula Rosa, and how that has continued to plague with the spread of uranium. And then we've got the oil and gas industry in the Four Corners and also in the Northeast. And you can see the patches in between of various things. So just when we say who it does it affect, I just want to show you who and where and how.
Will, I wanted to see if you wanted to take on this question too about, you know, this aspect of the visible and the invisible when it comes to environmental racism, in terms of what you've observed in your community and even elsewhere.
Sure, yeah, and maybe I'll do that through sharing some images as well. I've been doing a project lately that's kind of focused on the legacy of uranium extraction on the Navajo Nation. So this is the rare metal site that I was just talking about, and this is a map showing where it is in relation to the city, the community I grew up in the Western Navajo Agency. Now it's a Superfund site, right? And there's some remediation that's taken place in relation to this. but in relation to the idea of environmental racism and this notion of I can't breathe, you know, it makes me think of the people who worked in those mines and the families that kind of welcomed these people home and were exposed to the contamination, the houses that were built with this, you know, tailings debris from the mines. And the fact that the Atomic Energy Commission was fully aware that this stuff was toxic and poisonous. I mean, we hear a lot about the Navajo code talkers and how, you know, the war was won through the use of Navajo language. But I think what a lot of folks don't realize is, like, some of the fissile material was sourced from the Navajo Nation to create the, you know, the first nuclear weapons, and then later during the Cold War and the nuclear arms race, a lot of it was sourced from these sites as well. I mean, I think up until the 70s, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission was the sole kind of purchaser of this material. They were doing it through different, like, front corporations, but you know, so there has been some kind of recourse for people who are exposed. You know, there's the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, but, you know, again, a lot of people who are working in those mines spoke very little English. They were paid with cash. There's no, like, real paper trails in relation to that. So it's hard to prove, like, a direct connection to that history and to, you know, get some form of compensation in relation to that. This is the Church Rock United Nuclear Corporation uranium mill spill site that Valerie was talking about. And these are some of my images, and this is part of this Connecting the Dots, like, project where, you know, I'm starting to kind of do an aerial survey in some ways of these different sites. This is on the Babbitt Ranch, just kind of south of the Navajo Nation, but it's right next to the Little Colorado River. And you can also see the depressions in the landscape. This is actually an upgrading facility. But those depressions in the landscape, they're you know, they fill with water. They're contaminated. Livestock drink from that water. People eat the livestock. These are the evaporation ponds that are part of the remediation project at the Church Rock spill site. This is an amazing kind of monument to the legacy of this history at Mexican Hat, Utah. There's 4,400,000 tons of radioactive mine tailings and kind of the legacy of that site. And, you know, when I was photographing this with my drone, I kind of zoomed in on it and I noticed this thing out in the middle of the kind of sea of river rocks. And, you know, there's this really bizarre plaque out there memorializing this site in the center. You know, and I also think about how, like, these technologies are also kind of empowering in some ways. This is the White Mesa Uranium Processing Mill. And this is only 2 or 3 miles upgrade from the Ute Mountain, like, reservation. And, you know, I mean, it's clearly a kind of present source of contamination, and it's only a couple miles away from, you know, an indigenous community today.